Today's conversation is often phrased as a question, and this is the question. Is ransomware inevitable for public institutions, or are we failing? But this question is a trap. When executives ask it, they usually mean, are we doing a bad job? And when CISOs hear it, they feel pressure to respond with, no, 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 we're fine. And then they usually jump straight into controls and checklists and that default response. But when we ask the question this way, the framing of this, it doesn't really help leadership make better decisions. So I want to be very explicit from the start. The leadership decision here is not whether ransomware can be prevented. Instead, the leadership decision is whether public institutions are designed to continue operations when prevention fails. Phrased this way, this is a continuity decision, not a cybersecurity debate. So let's put this into context. Why government and education and why others should care. So today I'm going to focus on government and education, cities and counties and state agencies, school districts, public universities, because currently forecasts are telling us that these are the highest hit industries, but it's applicable across all industries. So what we're talking about is ransomware, and the likelihood is currently rated as very high, and the trend is rising. But even if you're a CISO outside of government or education, don't tune out, because the mechanisms that I'm going to talk about apply anywhere. So any organization that doesn't have the ability to simply pause operations, and there are no operational constraints about modernized budgets, you have no delivery service people dependent on you every day, right? So if you don't have those, then this isn't for you. But everybody else that does have that, stay tuned, because this is you. So we're going to reframe inevitable, which is really a risk acceptance decision. So when people say ransomware is inevitable, what they usually mean is it just keeps happening, right? It just keeps happening. It's not going away. It must be unstoppable. It must be inevitable. But that's not really accurate, because it is predictable. Ransomware isn't inevitable the way that gravity is inevitable. It is persistent because the conditions that attract attackers haven't changed. So for public institutions, those conditions include things like essential services where disruption creates pressure, legacy systems that take time to modernize, tight budgets that slow down recovery. Does this sound like your organization? Okay. So when the forecast says that's a very high likelihood, the takeaway is not we're failing. Instead, the takeaway is this: we are operating in a persistent threat environment where repeated pressure is expected. Does that make sense? And this is how you use the cyber risk forecast, because I will give you this kind of risk quantification. So this is really a risk acceptance decision, whether or not leadership is naming it that way. Why this is an executive risk and not an IT risk? Here's where the framing really matters. In government and education, ransomware doesn't primarily show up as an IT outage, although you might think of it in those terms. Instead, it shows up as a dispatch disruption. Schools and universities get shut down. Payroll, benefits, billing delays, confused or delayed public communication. This is how it shows up. And the dominant cost is not in the IT system repairs, although that's what a CISO might think. The dominant cost is the community impact, the downstream impact, or what you would call the client impact. It's the impact to trust, political credibility, if you're in that industry, public safety, or institutional stability. Whether or not clients, those that depend on your services, trust you anymore, or how they are impacted. That's why the success condition for public institutes is not, did we have 0 incidents? Instead, it's, can we continue to serve the public even under attack? This is a continuity decision, and it belongs at the executive level. And this is why, or how, as a CISO, you have this conversation with your board. So translating the cyber forecast, we are looking at making decisions in 30, 60, and 90-day blocks. That's how I present this to you. So let's turn a very high likelihood in rising into a concrete decision conversation. So in the next 30 days, you are looking for readiness, which is authority and prioritization of decisions. Over the next 30 days, the risk is not perfection, it is readiness. And leadership should be able to answer some questions around this. This is the conversation you will have. Who has the decision authority in the first 48 hours? Which services are protected and restored first? And how do we communicate externally without confusion? Okay, so there's 3 questions in the first 48 hours that you should be asking leadership for input on. If those answers aren't clear before an incident, there's going to be debate during the incident, and that delay will turn what might just be a disruption into a crisis. So again, this is an authority decision and a priority decision. Now, over the next 60 days, your focus should be on exposure and coupling. In other words, risk-shaping decisions. Over the next 60 days, the risk is about exposure and reliability. Okay? So the questions that you need to ask leadership are, what remains unpatched because it's hard? Where are credentials broader than they should be? And which small compromises would cascade and become where segmentation is weak, right? So where small compromises in the architecture would lead to bigger problems. This is also where leadership must understand the system coupling. When budgets are tight, systems become tightly coupled. And tightly coupled systems fail together. So if identity, email, ERP, or student information systems go down, what else goes down with them? This isn't a technical question. It's an impact-shaping decision. Now, let's pivot and look at the next 90 days out. In the next 90 days, looking forward, you're talking about outcomes, which are continuity decisions. So over the next 90 days, leadership needs to confront the following outcomes. How long are core services realistically offline? When does a disruption become a public safety issue? And can we operate manually while the restoration is underway? This is where the total cost is determined. And this is the heart of the decision. So when you're having the conversations, you're not talking about IT systems, you're talking about continuity and costs. So ask leadership, are we designed for recovery and continuity, or are we just hoping that somehow the preventions hold and this doesn't happen? Because that's a bad perspective to take. The most dangerous executive misconception is the misconception that causes the most damage, and it's this. Ransomware is an IT problem. It's far more than an IT issue. IT is what you use to help prevent it, but it's the executive decisions that really control the outcome. So for public institutions, it's not, is it a continuity, or rather it is a continuity and governance problem. Control effectiveness in this environment is realistically only moderately effective. So you can do many things right and still experience an incident. So again, it's a trick question. It's not a failure. So the goal is not to promise that we're not going to get hit. You can't really realistically promise we're not going to experience it. RT security is strong enough to withstand that, because it's not true. We're seeing evidence that that's just not true. Instead, the goal is to ensure if we are hit, the event is survivable. And that reframes the entire executive conversation. So what actually turns incidents into crisis is decision failures. Across public institutions, prolonged ransomware impact almost always traces back to decision failures, not tool failures. And understanding that and having that analysis and history is what allows you to pivot this conversation. Things like unclear restoration priorities, unrealistic recovery assumptions, flat networks, weak isolation, delayed or inconsistent public communication, and confusion over who decides what and when. So now let's be very, very specific. The specific failure modes that turn a ransomware incident into a prolonged crisis for public institutions. Okay, let's walk through these. 1, unclear prioritization. So when everything is critical, nothing is, right? So in the first hours of an incident, teams lose time debating what should be restored first. There's your failure. Number 2, unrealistic recovery assumptions. Backups exist, but restores are slow. Systems are intertwined. You probably have lots of credentials that are shared, and the organization has never practiced bringing services up from a cold start. Okay, that's how it fails. Number 3, lack of isolation. Networks are flat. Administrative accounts can see way too much, right? So there's too much exposure there. And one compromised endpoint becomes a pathway into domain-level control. That's the failure. Number 4, communication chaos. So for public institutions, they have to communicate with citizens, parents, students, staff, and sometimes media. When message is delayed or inconsistent, the trust erodes, and that eroded trust becomes part of the impact, leads to the confusion. Number 5, role confusion. This is how it fails. In an incident, the technical team is trying to contain, the operations team is trying to deliver services, and leadership is trying to manage community response. If you haven't rehearsed who decides what, you're going to lose time, and ransomware outcomes are extremely time sensitive. So that is where you have the failure. Now, none of these are purely technical. They are governance and operational decisions. And that's why the "we are failing" framing is misleading. Because the biggest failures in ransomware outcomes usually happen at the decision level. What was funded? What was prioritized? What was rehearsed? And what assumptions were left untested? Okay? So, how you as a CISO should frame this to leadership. Here's the executive level framing that actually works. First, remove the moral judgment. This sector is being targeted repeatedly. We need to design for resilience, right? Second, translate risk into time. How long would services be down, and what does that do to trust and mission delivery? Time. Next, you need to make a trade-off explicit. We can invest to reduce the probability of this, or we can invest to reduce the duration and impact. In our environment, continuity investments change outcomes more reliably. You have to shift that focus. Now, reframing funding. When you are, as a CISO, talking to the board, you ask for budget to reduce outage duration, not for cybersecurity. Ask for budget to reduce the outage duration. Okay. Language matters, because decisions follow language. So, one decision-forcing action you can take in the next 30 days. If leadership does only one thing this month, make it this. Identify the top 3 services you cannot afford to lose and run a real restore and operations exercise, not a tabletop only, but a real restore. In compliance, you're doing a lot of tabletop. That's not what we're talking about. You're going to restore from offline backups. Operations will manually discover any issues in the recovery, and you're going to measure the true restore time and the actual staffing you need to do that. Okay, that's way different than a tabletop. This forces prioritization. It exposes hidden dependencies. It turns abstract risk into measurable reality, and it gives leadership defensible funding priorities. So this is how you get that funding piece that can be so difficult. Okay, so let me wrap up. The decisions that matter in ransomware, it's not that it's inevitable, that's not the question, and the answer is not inevitable. The answer is it's a very high likelihood with repeat pressure, and that means real executive decisions. Okay, that's how you're going to use the forecast and reframe. Will we be ready to keep serving the public when the threat arrives? Because it will arrive. In government and education, ransomware is not a cyber event. It is a community impact event. And the institutions that do best are going to be the ones that treat continuity as the control, not the afterthought. Okay? If you like this, please subscribe, and I will see you in the next video.